Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Sunday Speaker Series Dinner Theater.
What's the dinner?
Yeah, dinner is on its way. You'll have to wait a little longer. This is it's interesting to be doing this on the day we're celebrating St. Luke's Day, and so that's why we have all this. And these tables will be full of food shortly. So I guess we need to kind of get out of the way, don't we? Get through the lesson, get out of the way. We're in our third and last session for this particular class, and I'm very grateful for all of you who have been here, as well as for those who have watched this online. This has been an interesting series for me to do. The subjects that I've been dealing with, that I've had the privilege to deal with in this class, are ones that I have wanted to dive into for quite a long time. And you know how it is, you get busy and those types of things, and so don't have a formal class where I am able to really get into this stuff. I tend to do, my wife is sometimes amazed at how long I spend prepping, and the reason is because I get into and start doing reading, and I'm one of those who just gets lost in the reading before long hours have passed, and so you're getting unfortunately a taste of what I've been able to access. But it's always a pleasure to be able to get into these subjects. So one of the topics that was exciting to me, especially, was the one that we're going to talk about today. That is Christ as poet. Now part of this lesson today is going to seem a little bit like a literature lesson, and I'm going to try to I'm not a literature expert, but going to try not to spend too much time on that. We do need to give a little bit of foundation, as always, before we jump into what Christ was doing as a poet. I do want to give this is connected to the class I taught last year. This is an image from one of the earliest synagogues that they were able to find dates from around 200 AD in Dura Europos in Turkey. And they found a lot of art there. And so there's a church there, a house church there that has a lot of art in it. There's a Jewish synagogue in the same town that has a lot of art in it. This is an image of Moses from the Jewish synagogue. But a lot of scholars, there's these questions. What did Jesus really look like? Okay, and so we have in our Western culture for many generations, I grew up with the notion that Jesus was a blonde, blue-eyed guy, right? So there's a somewhat of an appropriation, cultural and ethnic appropriation of Christ. And, people argue back and forth on whether that's a good thing. But those who have studied what people looked like, in terms of the actual from-life images from the time, suggest shockingly that Jesus probably didn't have long hair. And so, we have all these images of Jesus with the flowing locks. And, I remember as a kid, every Easter season we had to watch King of Kings on television, and so you have these images of Jesus. He probably didn't have long hair, and he probably didn't have, a huge beard as well. So there are many scholars who look at this picture of Moses, including the clothes that he was wearing, and suggest that this is probably a bit more accurate of what Jesus might have looked like. So, as we talk about Jesus as the dialogue and the parables, and now the poet, the idea is that he would have looked a little bit more like somewhat of what they would call a philosopher or even a rabbi, and this is similar. So the important thing is this is a Jewish image, okay? And a lot of the images we get of Christ are not Jewish, so this is a Jewish image, and so I just think that is a cool bit of curiosity. But anyway, we all have images in our heads from when we were children. But speaking of when we were children, as we move into this notion of poetry, and one of the themes that we have talked about quite a bit in this class is, the strategy of using dialogue, the strategy of using parables, and Father Joel mentioned it again today as he talked about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And we've, mentioned the parable of the prodigal son and all of these other parables. We remember these parables. So there is this memorable aspect of storytelling that gets into our DNA, as it were, and we remember details about these stories that we probably would not remember about doctrine, for instance. You know, we have probably, all of us at one point or another, heard an explanation of the Trinity. But it would be kind of curious for us to go around and see what we remember from that, right? So, you know, when it comes to these types of orthodox, even doctrine types of things, depending on your tradition, even Episcopal tradition, there's lots of things that are part of the tradition that we don't necessarily remember that well, but we remember stories. We also remember poems. Okay, so we're going to do a little experiment here. Do a little class participation. There are poems that you learned as a child, right? That you remember to this day. Okay? Do we want to have any volunteers for a poem? Now, used to be in schools that you had to memorize seriously long poems. Right? They don't do that anymore. But there are quite a few things that we learned as kids, even as small children, that we remember today. There's these things called nursery rhymes, you know, that we remember. So, anybody remember the poem that goes with this picture? Okay. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Yay, you remember. All right. How long ago was it that you learned that poem? Okay. 10 years ago, yes. It's fresh. But you know, think of it. Gosh, you could probably rattle off any number of nursery rhymes right now. Okay. Hickory dickory dock. Mouse climbed up the clock. Clock struck 10. You know, 3 blind mice. See how they run? Yeah. You could go on and on and on. We remember those. Jack and Jill ran up the hill, fetch a pail of water. So these are all part of our culture. But they are, it is the poetic structure and nature of those that drives them like nails into our memories. Okay? And nowadays, poetry isn't as, let me say it this way, poetry. Okay. When we think of poetry today, we think of this kind of exalted, British accented thing almost that is, you know, deep personal expression. And I'm not mocking it, seriously. But poetry has kind of moved into this very esoteric type of thing. Not long ago, maybe even 2 generations ago, not quite 2 full generations ago, poetry was a regular part of people's lives. All right, it was something that was featured regularly in even newspapers. You could get poems, daily poems in newspapers and things like that. So we've moved away from that in terms of that type of thing, but we continue to access poetry today through music. All right, so we all have our favorite musicians and singers and artists and singer-songwriters. I'm going to confess, I was listening to Andy Williams this morning. So, you know, this maybe dates me a little bit, but, you know, when I just want to calm down, you know, and feel soothed, there's just nothing quite like the mellow voice of Andy Williams. And I'm listening to him before I know it, I'm singing with him. Okay, because I know the lyrics of these songs that I heard when I was younger, much younger. So we still have poetry and the structures of poetry as a part of our lives today, a memorable part of our lives, that's kind of been reserved now to kind of the musical sphere. Okay. So, you know, what is poetry? Now, I took a grad course in poetry and found out poetry is a lot different from nursery rhymes. It's not exclusively or not reserved for just nursery rhymes. It's not reserved for any number of sort of, you know, specific niches. Poetry is across the board. In fact, some poetry can be defined by just the way it looks on the page. All right? So the structure of the words on the page is one form of poetry. And then there is other poetry that is just the sounds. Okay? So you can really, many of us probably read E.E. Cummings at some point as a poet who didn't capitalize anything. And I remember how aggravated I was the first time I saw that, being somewhat of a grammar Nazi. I saw the unpunctuated, non-capitalized, and I was like, what is this? But it is moved much more into this sort of creative expression, which is not wrong, because poetry comes from the word poema, the Greek word poema. Okay, so poetry is the contemporary noun form of this Greek word poema, and poema simply means created, made. Okay, so something created, made. There's this wonderful verse. We are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus. The Greek word used there, we are God's poema. We are God's poem. Okay? Isn't that a beautiful thought? We are God's poem. We are his workmanship. So a lot of us today say, poetry isn't my thing. And that's fine, because that's our perception. And I add, or is it? Because I contend that we are still steeped in poetic forms. We've just sort of moved them around in our lives to where they aren't what we think of as poetry, but they're still there, and they're still very important to us. And if we're Christians, guess what? We are actually always diving into and sort of swimming in poetic language. We're just not necessarily aware of it. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today, is the degree to which we are still connected to poetic language. So, characteristics again of poetry. It's memorable. It takes language another step. Okay, we have a variety of sentences, and I'm not going to get into all the different types, but most of what we sort of deal with in daily basis is something called the declarative sentence. All right? A declarative sentence declares something. Do you remember your old grammar lessons? Noun, verb, noun, preposition, all this type of stuff. Declarative just says, this is the case. All right? So poetry takes language. You might actually use a declarative sentence, but it takes it another step. Bends our mind around something in a different way. And reveals truth a lot of times, or an emotion, or a feeling, or any number of different things. Just kind of seeing things from a different angle. It creates layers of meaning, and ultimately poetry is made to be shareable. The lamentation of many poets today, and I know several poets, several accomplished poets, is that you can't make any money as a poet. Okay, poetry just doesn't sell these days. So there are, small circles of poets who print stuff together on what are called chapbooks, and they have sort of a limited circulation. The poet writes poetry for the love of language and poetry today. It's not something that's necessarily a bestseller. Recently passed Irish poet Seamus Heaney was probably one of the better known poets of the day, and he had to dabble in a lot of other stuff as well, including translation work, to make a living. So part of what we're dealing with as we move into Christ as poet is this idea that we've really got to rewind, keep throwing us back in time. And so one of the aspects of important aspects as we dive into what Jesus was doing is that in the ancient world, again, as a reminder one more time, very few people were readers. Okay? So, there was a handful of people who learned to read, an even smaller group of people who learned to write. Writing wasn't an easy thing necessarily. And it was their job to share what was written with other people, but that implies that what was written was somehow more important than what was spoken. That was not the case. What was spoken was considered very, very important. And you developed traditions, oral traditions over the years. Well, to remember these better, these oral traditions were created in verse, what we call verse. They had meter, they had things, parallelism and other aspects that made it easier to remember. I was just talking earlier about stuff that I teach, and one of the things that I teach are the classics, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid. All of these were written, but first recited in verse, long before they were written down. They had been recited in verse for 200 or 300 years before they were actually written down. Pretty faithfully, for 200 or 300 years before they were ever written down. So the way this was done was by the way the meter worked and language conventions worked. And one of the things that students notice as they read this, they do a lot of repeating. You know, why do they say the same phrase over and over and over again? It's because it's easier to remember. And it kind of served as a way to then transition to something else. So all of these ancient cultures did that, including the Hebrew culture. Okay, we like to think that, you know, because they did more writings than some other cultures, that they were different in that emphasis. The fact of the matter is, in terms of the importance of orality, of oral traditions, they were the same as the other cultures. But what we then get in our Bible, in our Old Testament, is that eventually some of these things were written down that had been oral traditions for a long time. And a lot of what we get in the Old Testament is actually poetry. So there are, from the Jewish perspective, there's the Torah, and then there's the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is divided into, this is the Jewish Old Testament that we now have today. The Tanakh is divided into different parts. One of those parts is the Ketuvim, which is the writings. All right, so you've got the histories, okay, and you have the books of Moses, and then the histories, the Chronicles and the Kings, and those type of things. And then you have the writings. And in the writings are included wisdom literature, which we read from Ecclesiasticus today, which if you came out of an evangelical tradition, you see that name and you're like, what the heck is that? Okay, so Ecclesiasticus is a wisdom literature book. But then there were books that were written in verse. The Psalms were written in verse. They were meant to be chanted. And so we preserve that in the Episcopal tradition, Anglican Episcopal tradition. Sometimes they chant them, actually. We chant them in one of our services. Other times you just do antiphonal readings. Then they are often put to music. The Psalms, it's interesting, in the life of C.S. Lewis, they paired C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot, the poet, to actually work on a revision of the Psalter for the Book of Common Prayer, the English Book of Common Prayer. They wanted them to revise it and make it just a little more lyrical. So they worked on it for along with another committee, for about 3 years. And then it was put before whoever the people were that had to decide it, and they said, no, we like the old one better. So, all that work for nothing eventually. But basically, they didn't want to change the translation as much as they wanted to just kind of change the wording a little bit to make it a little bit more lyrical. But it's lyrical enough. So wisdom literature was the Emmet. Then there was the Five Scrolls. But then there was the Song of Solomon, which one of the sources that I read that I'll mention here in a little bit said that by the time, and I'm going to talk about things lost in translation as I get down here, by the time it had been translated into Greek and then into a bunch of other languages and Latin and then into English, it was no longer the Song of Songs, it was the Prose of Prose. Okay, so when it was originally written in the Hebrew, it was a very lyrical, poetic work. Lamentations, a lot of people are unaware, Lamentations is a work of poetry. Okay? And so Job is a poetic work as well. So you have these works that were created as written in verse and created to be recited. One of the things that's hard for us to remember and sometimes not think about, because we're so, glued into reading, we don't realize that so many of these things were written to be heard. Okay? And I remember I am a huge fan of what were, used to be books on tape, but now it's applications like Audible and things like that. And so the first time I listened to some of these epics, including, Dante's Divine Comedy and the Odyssey, Paradise Lost, and these others, the first time I actually listened to them, I was like, oh, it makes so much sense now. They are supposed to be heard. Huge difference in the experience. It's almost theatrical in nature when you hear them. Okay? So that is what they were meant. That was the purpose of this medium. And it's so much more powerful and so much more strong when they are actually heard, recited and heard. So we have an issue here with the teachings of Christ in particular, but also with the Old Testament. And that is that they were translated into Greek. Now, fortunately, and I preface this with a very clear declaration, I am not a linguist, okay? So, I've studied just enough biblical language to be dangerous, all right? But I'm not a linguist, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, not a Greek scholar, had a couple of years of New Testament Greek. That's it, all right? So, but from what I have read by scholars is that there's a closer parallel between Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine Greek than there is between Greek and English, okay? So in terms of the time frame, shared meaning, concepts that were kind of known. And so when you have a term in Hebrew and or Aramaic, and there's a Greek term, there seems to be a closer resemblance. However, what you don't have is sameness of sound. So when you have the change from Hebrew Aramaic verse to Greek verse, it's now Greek verse. Okay? It's not Hebrew Aramaic verse. So some of the wordplay, for instance, is missed. In fact, just a fascinating thing, some folks recently did a study of Shakespearean English in the plays and discovered that we were pronouncing the words wrong. Okay? That Shakespearean English has a very distinct pronunciation. And by doing research, they actually figured out a closer way to pronounce Shakespearean English. And when they did this and recited these plays out loud, they discovered puns and wordplay that they didn't know was there. Okay? This was just like this huge revelation. Oh, he was having some fun over here. They didn't realize that until they actually changed some of the pronunciation. So sound makes a difference. And part of what can be done in what you might call language art or word art is you can play with the sounds. I had an old professor who loved, saying things like Matthew 8:8. Matthew was a cannibal. Matthew 8:8. So we have these wordplay. All right. So they had those in other languages as well. So let's just talk briefly about Hebrew poetry. And this is where, don't fall asleep on this. I'm just going to gallop through this. But some of the things that you get are consonants, vowels, a little bit of rhyme. But rhyme isn't as big a thing in Hebrew poetry as it is for us. Rhyme is much easier to do in almost any other language other than English. Any idea why? If you've studied any other language, you realize that every other language, almost every other language, is what's called inflected. That means it has endings that tell you what the tense of that verb is and things like that. And they're all the same, or very similar. So you can end a line with the same syllable a whole lot easier in these other languages than we can in English, which is borrowed heavily from German and French, with some Latin thrown in there, and some Greek, and a whole bunch of other languages combined. So consonants, vowels, rhymes. So here's an example. Desolation, devastation, and destruction. Okay? You've got some same consonants in there. You've got same vowels in there. Desolation, devastation, destruction. And you have the same ending. Shun, shun, shun. All right? So think of a language where you can do a whole lot more of this type of thing than we can in English. And that's what you get with a lot of these ancient languages. So, Nahum, which is a prophet, much of the wording in the book of Nahum, is poetic. And a lot of the utterances by the prophet are delivered in this kind of wordplay. Then you have Lamentations, which is written with, heavily used in, meter is used in Lamentations. And then you have synonyms and common pairings. So some of the pairings are, your hand in the Psalms, your hand will reach your enemies, your right hand. And so you'll have hand, right hand. And you sort of this emphasis that is given over and over and over in the Psalms. And as you read the Psalms, you can see these things, then lots of imagery. So nature, trees, grass, rivers, mountains, wild animals are all used to kind of, and this again is a very ancient type of thing. It's what you get throughout the ancient epics are these, they'll just pause and make a comparison. You know, the Greeks storming the shores are like a flock of seagulls, you know, on the beach, that type of thing. So you get these word pictures. And then you get lots of parallel items. Make known to me your ways, teach me your paths. So it's basically the same idea expressed more than once, or just basically the words kind of changed around. So that's the nature of Hebrew poetry. Then we get to Greek poetry. We get, again, these epic stories. The Greeks were extremely into poetic expression. And so you get, they had verse for just about every occasion. And so, you know, for funerals, for weddings. So you had all of these uses, various uses of poetry. In plays that were enormously popular, especially in the city of Athens, where you would have upwards of 14,000 people watching a play that was presented without sound equipment. Okay? So in this large amphitheater, no sound equipment, the actors are out there, and they have these masks on, and the masks have kind of like mini speaking trumpets in them. But every line of every play is written in verse. So that's one of the ways that helped these people memorize these lines fairly quickly, but it was also a way to make these lines more memorable to the people in the audience as they're hearing these verse constructions. So all Greek plays, and later all Roman plays, are written in verse and recited in verse. So they referred to prose. The Greeks did not actually like prose. Prose is what we speak all the time, of course. But they thought it was not artful. It was inelegant. And they called it naked language, street language. Okay. Poetry, however, is language that dances or flies. And so a well-educated and well-spoken person was a person who could manipulate language in a way that was good to hear. Okay? So the speaker spent time making the language resonant, and the listeners didn't just like what was being said, they liked the way it was being said and the sound of it. made a lot of difference to them. An interesting modern example of that would be the Gettysburg Address. Okay, Abraham Lincoln totally broke with convention of the day, went back to ancient convention, sort of reinvents the wheel here, goes back to ancient convention, and gives at Gettysburg a short but utterly poetic speech that, by virtue of its poetic content, is still being memorized today. 77 years ago, our fathers on this continent, a new nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He created an eternal speech just by doing what the Greeks considered to be what you need to do. Okay, so Aristotle refers to this as pleasing use of language. So if you have something important to say, said the Greeks, say it well, please. Put some work into it. Make it sound good. Employing natural rhythms, harmonies, often dealing with common subjects, but ultimately encouraging a noble frame of mind. So part of what they want to happen with a speech is for people to walk away from that feeling more noble, thinking more highly, having been edified not just by the content, but by the structure itself. And this is an interesting aspect of language that I'm going to say somewhat categorically, we have lost. It's just not, it's very rare to see this anymore. It does happen, but it's rare, right? To see someone who cares about the structure of language enough that people go away going like, that just sounded great. And then Virgil, who writes the Aeneid, basically imbues into his whole structure of the way he uses language, divine purpose. Now, his divine was Jove, okay? But because he does this in the Aeneid, lots of Christians later on would say, oh, Virgil, yeah, he was a Christian. He's redeemed. He's a redeemed pagan because he's got so much God stuff in his writing. English poetry, I'm just going to venture to say we're all pretty familiar with it, and uses a lot of figures of speech, a lot of imagery. There's, I've got a typo there, sound and tone, format, meter, rhythm, or not. Nowadays, you don't have to have, they have various forms of what's called free verse, which you kind of do whatever you want to in some ways. But, as they say with poetry today, as they do with a lot of creative things, you need to know the rules before you break them, right? So, don't just toss things out there. But then a lot of use of creative form. So it still fills this function of poema in English. But what we've got, and what we have to remember, is that by the time we in English get what's in the Bible, this is not just talking about the words of Christ. We're talking about everything in the Bible. It has been washed through many cycles of washing and drying through other languages. And so the original content that includes some of these creative word structures and things like that, we just don't have access to. And that is lost to us. If you become a level of Hebrew scholar that you can enjoy those things, you have a level of blessing that the rest of humanity doesn't have. If you become enough of a Greek scholar even to know those things, to get access to those things, then you've accessed things that those of us in English didn't get. Okay? I ran into this when I ultimately became bilingual in Spanish and discovered that there are ways to say things in Spanish that you can't say in English. Okay? Didn't know that until I was involved in that, and there are energies in the words that are very different than they are in English. And this was very surprising to me. I had sort of come to language study with this assumption that everybody sort of wants to mean the same thing. And good friend who's from China, there was a Chinese poem on the wall. And he said, "Oh, that's a beautiful poem." I said, "What does it say?" He said, "There's no translation." He said, "It only makes sense in Chinese." He said, "There's no way I could actually put it into English that wouldn't destroy it." Okay, so that's part of what is happening. And it's sad, isn't it? It's kind of tragic. Part of what is happening in, bringing these things to us in English, we're getting elements of the truth, which is great. But there are parts of the whole language side of things that we're actually losing. Even so, we do get a sense of the poema that is present in Christ. This book that I have here, The Poems of Jesus Christ, Willis Barnstone is a very accomplished translator and ancient language individual. And his study of the New Testament, and especially the words of Christ, led him to the conclusion that Jesus almost never opened his mouth that he didn't speak in a form of verse. And so he demonstrates over and over and over again in this book how the utterances of Jesus are typically poetic, almost every time. They've got structure, they have parallelism, they have basically this broad, amazing use of all of these effective techniques, which when you stop and think about it, you're like, well, no wonder we remember so much of what Jesus said. It's not just because they were marked in red, and if you had your red letter edition of the Bible. But a lot of it is because, and I mean, how many of you grew up on the King James Version? We got, okay, KJV all the way. I have to say it, this is not, I'm not dissing contemporary English in any way. And I know, we've got new translations that are actually getting at some of the meaning a little better than the old ones. But maybe what they're not getting at is what the King James Version did actually do is there's a lyrical aspect to the King James that we haven't necessarily tried to capture quite as effectively in newer translations. Having said that, there is a recognition now of more of the poetic content, not just of what Jesus was saying, but of the rest of the Bible. And so there's an attempt to actually structure in verse and pull out into verse various aspects of Scripture that were meant to be that in the original Hebrew Aramaic, and/or Aramaic. Now, with the Gospels, what we have is this issue of Jesus more than likely speaking Aramaic, because that was the street language. But by the time they get into the Gospels, by the time Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are written, they are not written in Aramaic. All of the Gospels are written in Koine Greek. Okay, so they have already taken the words of Christ and sort of transported them into this other language. So Jesus would make statements that were in verse, but then as we get into the things that we, remember and celebrate and, put in frames on our walls or stitch into cross-stitch patterns and things like that, we've got these wonderful sayings of Christ that are absolutely poetry and that are Christ using words not just to express a truth, but creating something beautiful as well. And this is just a dimension of the ministry of Christ that I think maybe we take for granted. But we've got this other layer of his activity that goes beyond the healing and the touching of people and, dealing with the outcasts and having dinner with tax collectors and all of these revolutionary things that he did, above and beyond all of these things, the miracles and stuff like that, Jesus cared deeply about the sound of his language and worked on it. So you have this incredible. Now, having said that, a man that I know named Malcolm Guite, who is a poet in England, he writes so much poetry and has gotten so adept at it over the years that he can talk in poetry if he wants to. Okay, so he is so accustomed to working in this frame of mind that he can instantly create a poem. And that's part of, if you're working in that, if that's your clay that you're molding language from, and because the rest of us just don't do that, it's a lot harder, right? If we want to try to, get at this level of discourse. But if you're doing it all the time, it's a lot easier. So the Lord's Prayer. What I have here is a translation that more closely mirrors the way the Greek is done. The Greek, which I can read, is very elegant and beautiful, and the sounds are very poetic. But this kind of mirrors a little bit more. It doesn't get at what the Greek is doing precisely, but it is closer. Father ours, the one in the heavens, hallowed be the name of you. Come the kingdom of you. Done the will of you, as in heaven, even on earth. The bread ours, the coming day, give to us today. Forgive to us the debts of us, even as we forgive the debtors of us. And not bring us to temptation, but deliver us from the evil. Okay, so this is just structural. This is not something that would work terribly well in English. But you can see from the structure how, and this is preserving the structure, how it's just the way the statements are arranged just has more power from the standpoint of it can be it works for the ear. And it still works for the ear the way that we express it in our liturgy every time. So it's still effective even in the way it is we have worked on it. So then there's Beatitudes. I read an interesting article by a man who answers the question, are the Beatitudes poetry? And he does all this stuff, and then he says, no, they're not. And I'm like, what? There's nothing poetic about the Beatitudes, he says. This is a Bible scholar. And I'm like, okay, maybe this guy just doesn't know what poetry is. But the Beatitudes are very clearly a poetic work that are pronounced and beautiful. And so what you've got here is somebody who has gone and sort of represented the structure. You've got two stanzas that are totally parallel to one another. The beginning mirrors the ending, and the ideas are repeated, and you have the blessed, then the future, and all these. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then the way this is then spun out, and the rest of the first stanza, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And then you have sort of the second part, which brings these forward to the conclusion. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so the rhythmic nature of this is so much more powerful than just sort of and they all begin with the word blessed, all right? And in the Hebrew Aramaic and also in the Greek, you've got that same poetic emphasis again and again. So we talked already about the parables and the mashal that Jesus used in the structure of these stories even. You can actually see poetic structure in the way Jesus presents these stories, which is another thing that adds another layer of memorability for them. So the fascinating thing is that we then go on into further in the New Testament, and we have Paul, probably a little bit more than the other apostles, making use of being aware of some of the same types of structures. And so many times in his epistles, you get this same kind of rhythmic poema structure in the writings of Paul, so that, again, a lot of that can be memorized a lot more easily than some other stuff. But the famous one that we all know is 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy, does not boast, is not proud, is not rude, is not self-seeking, is not easily angered, to keep no record of wrongs. And so love never fails. And the great thing about these is so many of these things have actually been put to music, right? So it's because of their already strong poetic structure that it's not hard then to put these things to music and give even that level of reinforcement. So I want to wrap up here. This is kind of the point of all of this, and that is that art, we've spoken just about word art here, but this art being a representational and creative expression can be, and perhaps should be, part of what we as Christians use to persuade. If Christ and Paul and others were so effective using these tools, does this not beg the question? Should we not be doing the same? Should we not be paying attention to the sound of our language? Should we not be creating things that are memorable, that share truth? Kind of an open question that we'll get to here as we talk. I want to end with this quote by Walter Brueggemann, who wrote The Prophetic Imagination, and in which he talks about this very tension. According to Brueggemann, the characteristic way of a prophet is that of poetry and lyric. And he's using Christ as the primary example, sort of the apex of the prophet. Okay, so he talks about many of the other prophets, but then Christ is sort of the chief prophet. The characteristic way of a prophet is that of poetry and lyric. The task is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture. How do you break the paradigm? How do you move people from here to here? The evocation of an alternative reality consists, at least in part, in the battle for language. This takes us roaring back to Acts 2 and Pentecost and the granting of new utterance. Not just a gift of other tongues, but a gift with this one. A gift with this tongue to create new meaning for people to access. All right, let's talk. Got a few minutes here. What do you think? What do you think of this idea of Brueggemann's?
Well, I'm not sure how much noble thoughts float around, but we do have poets now. They're called rappers. And so there's a lot of that consciousness that they're trying to evoke and maybe change the dominant culture.
Yeah. No, you're right.
On as high standard as we like.
And rap can be a very, very effective tool. Yeah. It may not be to some of our taste, but but there are some very effective use of that. Yes, Judge.
How do you think by making a lot of the changes or making moves on improving girls I came to the Episcopal Church because of the liturgy when I was in college, but we said those same things over and over.
Yeah.
We heard and straight from highways
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm worried that we are losing, when we lose the poetic nature, we also lose the ability to remember.
Yeah. And I did not pay you to make that comment, but this is the fact that so much of this is preserved in the liturgy is really where we're headed, right? And this is, if you have the beauty of liturgical worship, not whether it's better than any other worship, but the beauty of liturgical worship is exactly this, right? The idea that the poetic is preserved there and is able to reinforce in our memory the things that are crucial and critical in our faith. So, yeah.
I was just going to say, when you put poetry to music, it makes it even more memorable.
Mhm.
Because I know in dementia, one of the last things that will trigger that mind is music.
Yes.
And I remember my mother thinking she couldn't sing, but the further she got into her dementia and being stimulated by music, she remembered.
Yes.
She knew every word, and she sang perfectly on the tone.
Yes.
So I think when we, in the Episcopal Church, we take the liturgy, put it into hymns,
Yeah.
and sing it year after year after year.
Yeah.
And I remember more liturgy from psalm, and that one of my choir directors reminded me that she who sings prays twice.
Ha, yes.
So we have
Yes.
to learn the music, which means we're
Mhm.
learning the liturgy, and then when we sing it, it's our second prayer.
She who sings prays twice. And
She taught me he, but I.
oh, he. All right.
thought she-
That's fine. we'll make it. We'll make it work. But no, I mean exactly this. My mother, who had Alzheimer's, one of the last things left to her was singing her favorite hymns, and she would just lay her head on my shoulder, and she'd just kind of hum away and sing this thing over and over and over again, which is it's just fantastic the way that works. Any closing thoughts?
The change from Hebrew Aramaic Greek to our translations now is lost. What's of the original meaning?
We've lost some of the nuances. Okay, so the things that are sort of unique to a language, we just can't get those back. Those are because those are a function of that language. We don't even necessarily know what those are. The open question is, are they that important? I think all they are is kind of like bonus material. It'd be cool if we had access to them, but we don't. So it's like, well. But I think we still have the essentials. And I deeply respect the work of translators, who are faced with these types of things and who realize, I've got a lot of work to do to try to capture some of that. So, have read lots and lots of the anguish of people who try to translate the Iliad and the Odyssey, for instance, and we keep getting new translations because everybody says, you got close, but you didn't get it right. And you may get the ideas right, but then you don't get the sound right. You may get the sound right, but you don't get the meter right. All of these types of things, some of that is what we're encountering here. And, they're doing the best they can do. I think we're still getting the elements of truth that we need. And to the degree that English can be respectfully and artfully built, I think they've tried to do that. So.
The thing that kept coming to mind for me this morning was Dead Poet Society and the joy of discovering meaning and hearing the
Right.
and the rhythm and all the moments in that film that are structured around this moment in which the young men in class are first exposed to the elevated language.
Right.
And it captures their imagination in a way that transports them, challenges them, that transforms their lives
Mm-hmm.
in a way that causes them to rise up to
Yeah.
the point of standing on desks at the end of the day.
Yes, yes.
That it is the way in which poetry calls to us
Mm-hmm.
in a way that reaches into that quote you shared, and I wish
Oh.
We are created.
Yes.
Was just, speaks to that nature of our created being to
Right.
feel ourselves pulled out of ourselves.
Mhm. Yes, we are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus. Beautiful, beautiful thought. We are God's poema. That's a good thought to end on. Thank you, folks. Appreciate you being here.